All right, let's kick things off by covering what in the world is HTML. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And what this mumbo jumbo gibberish means is that HTML is not a programming language. It is in fact a markup language. Okay, that is good, but what makes HTML so important and well worth our time learning it? You see, HTML is responsible for the structure of the web pages. And that makes HTML elements the building blocks of the web. HTML elements are represented by this syntax: content in between the tags. More precisely, opening tag, which consists of the name of the element we would like to use, surrounded by the angle brackets. Following the opening tag, we have the content that will be displayed on a web page. And after that, we have another tag, this time closing tag. In the closing tag, we need to add / before the name of the element. So essentially, if we would want to have a heading in our project, we would create a heading tag or heading element with the text we would want to display on the page. And once we do that, the heading would be displayed on our web page. If we would want to add a paragraph, we would create a paragraph element. And if we would want to add an image, we would do the same thing. And hopefully you get the gist. Some elements consist of only one tag. So essentially, they don't have a closing tag. For example, image and line break elements. In those cases, we would add a / at the end of the single tag. I would like to mention that starting with HTML5, we could technically get away with it and omit the / altogether, and everything would still be displayed correctly. But for example, React, the most popular JavaScript framework on the block, has stricter rules and throws an error if the / is missing. Just to give you an early taste of HTML, let's open up a new browser window and navigate to literally any web page. Now, depending on the complexity of a web page, there are going to be a lot of other things as well, but we'll definitely see HTML in action. So I'm going to open up a new browser window, and then I'm going to look for ESPN. And once I'm going to navigate to a page, I'm going to open up developer tools. Please keep in mind during the course, of course, we're going to cover how we can do that. But for the time being, I'm just going to right click it. Then I'm going to look for inspect elements. And if you're going to take a look at it on the left hand side, you're going to see a bunch of opening and closing tags. And that is essentially the content that is displayed on the page. So regardless of how complicated the actual page is, we always are going to use HTML in order to structure web pages. And that's why when it comes to web development, HTML is so important. In order to do any kind of web development, we for sure will need two things: a text editor to create and work on our projects, and a browser to test our results. While there are many options out there, for this course, we will use Google Chrome as our web browser and Visual Studio Code as our text editor. While I can go on and on about why I picked these two specific tools, in a short one-sentence answer, both of them are industry leaders and provide awesome development experiments. Both of them are for free and require just a simple download. While it's not a requirement, meaning if you prefer other browser or text editor, feel free to use them, since you'll still be able to follow along with the course. If you want the same exact results as me all the time, I would suggest using both of these awesome tools. And I guess we're going to start by downloading Google Chrome browser. And in this case, I'm going to use the default browser that is on my operating system, which is Safari. And yes, as a side note, of course, since I'm using Google Chrome daily, I already had it on my machine. But since I wanted to start together with you from the scratch, I deleted it, and now we're going to install it together. So like I said, I'm going to open up my default browser. Then I'm going to look for Google Chrome in search. So let's type Google Chrome. And then the first link is obviously going to be a link to official Chrome webpage. We're going to click on a link. And then once we do, we right away going to see on a screen that they detect what operating system we're using. In my case, that is Mac. And we just bravely click on the link, download Chrome for Mac. Once we do, we're going to navigate to another page where essentially they tell us what we need to do. So we are going to get the installer, then we're going to drag it to our application, and eventually we're just going to open up the web browser. So let's follow these 3 steps. So I'm going to look for my downloads. I'm going to open up the installer. Then once I do, of course, I'm going to have to just wait a bit. As you can see, the process is taking place right now. And then once we're complete with this step, then of course we're going to have our Google Chrome application. Then after that, my next step is going to be drag and dropping the Google Chrome into my applications. And once that is complete, then of course we can just inject the installer. So let's wait a few more seconds. And then once that process is complete, then I can navigate to my installer and I can just eject it. Okay. Once that is done, then you can use my Finder again, or in fact, I can use my Launchpad and then I can look for my Google Chrome. So I'm going to open this up and I'm right away going to right click it and I'm going to keep it in the dock. And in this case, it's just going to ask you whether we would want to open up the application since it has been downloaded from the web. Yep, we're going to say that that is true. So like I said, again, I'm going to use option where we would want to keep it in the dock. And then I would want to right click it and essentially just open up the Google Chrome browser. Now you don't have to follow the steps that I'm going to be taking, but I'm going to set this as a default browser. And as you can see, it right away gives you this option where you can have it set as default. So first of all, let me show you. This would be if we zoom in, and this is going to step that I'm going to take. Again, you don't have to do it, but this is just going to make it easier for you. I'm going to click on it. Then I'm going to say use Chrome. And now this is going to be set as my default browser. Now, also one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on my browser window. So that way you can see clearer everything that is happening. Again, that is probably not something you need to do. But for me, since I'm recording the screen, I think it's just going to be easier if you're going to see everything clearer. And the way you can zoom in and zoom out on the browser is just by pressing Command and plus and minus. So as you can see now, I'm zooming in. And if I press Command and minus, then I'm going to be zooming out. Once we have downloaded and installed Google Chrome browser, why don't we put it to good use and do the same thing with Visual Studio Code, our text editor. So this time I'm going to open up the Google Chrome browser. Then I'm going to look for Visual Studio Code. And of course, let me show you what is the proper text that I'm typing, like so. Then I'm going to zoom out again. And then in this case, we're looking for this link. We have Visual Studio Code. And obviously, in this case, we're going to be navigating to a homepage. Again, we navigate here. We right away can see that they are detecting our operating system. Again, in this case, it is going to be Mac. We click on it and we're starting to download the installer package. Of course, if you're using the different operating system, they're going to provide you with different installation package. Now, once the download is complete, then I'm going to look for my downloads folder, like so. Again, let me show you. This is my downloads folder. And right next to Google Chrome, of course, I have my installer package from Visual Studio Code. I'm going to crack it open. Now I have my Visual Studio Code. I'm going to double click, like so. Left double click. This is going to open up, of course, the application. I'm going to say yes, open. I would like to do it. And also, I want to drag and drop it into my applications. So I'm just going to grab Visual Studio Code. I'm going to hover over applications, and now my Visual Studio Code is going to be in the applications. And also notice here in the bottom, and by the way, I closed it, but notice here in the bottom, I also have an option of keep it in dock. I'm going to click yes, and now I'm going to open up right away from the dock. And now successfully, we have downloaded both things. We have downloaded our Visual Studio Code, the text editor we're going to use for the remainder of the course, as well as the Google Chrome browser. Okay, with both of our downloads complete, why don't we quickly take a look at the Visual Studio Code. Now, I'm not going to do an extensive introduction because I would want to get up and running with HTML, but I'm just going to give you a general overview. And then the more and more we're progressing with the course, of course, we're going to come back and we're going to explore Visual Studio Code in a bigger detail. First of all, this is going to be a welcoming screen. In your case, if you just installed the Visual Studio Code, you're probably not going to have recent projects. The only reason I have it is because, of course, I deleted it again, the same as with Chrome, and then download it together one more time together with you. Now I'm going to close this up. So I'm going to close the tab. And then on the left-hand side here, you can see that we have the icons. We have the Explorer. This is going to show us all the files we're going to be working on. This is going to allow us to search for files. This is going to be the source control Git, which we're going to cover a little bit later in the course, and also debugging. Now, I can tell you right away that most of the course we're going to work with Explorer, and then once in a while we're going to look for the bottom one for the extensions. And essentially, extensions are just a way for us to add some additional features to our text editor. And then as you're progressing, let's say if you're going to be working with JavaScript, you're going to get some extensions for JavaScript. If you're going to be working with React, you would get some specific extensions for React. In our case, we're going to get few of them. Again, we're not going to get tons in the beginning because I would want to progress with actual HTML. But as we're working, we're going to explore extensions more and we're going to download them. Now, let me show you how the extensions would work. So these would be all the extensions you can search for, of course. Now, the fastest way to search for them is just going to be typing here. So let's say if I'm going to say JavaScript, and then you can see that we have tons of extensions available. And once I'm going to show you how we download the first one, then you're going to be able to see the extensions that you have in your text editor currently. Because, of course, at the moment, we don't have any. Like I said, most of the time we're going to work with our Explorer. And as far as Explorer, we have the sidebar. This is where we're going to see our files. So in this case, this is going to be, I don't know, the folders we're going to use, the files we're going to use, and all that. And then here on the right-hand side, this is where we're going to be writing our code. So two places. On one place, we're going to have files. And then on the second one, we're going to have the code that we're going to be typing. So the web pages or projects we're going to be creating. And then all the way in the bottom, one more important thing that I would like to cover is the fact that for each and every editor, you can customize the settings. So essentially things like font size, things like what is the zoom level, and that sort of thing. And we have two ways how we can operate that. First, we have this option where essentially we have the GUI. And again, in this case, I'm going to zoom in. Notice we have, for example, font size. So at the moment, this is 12. So essentially, obviously, we're going to change it a little bit later to a different font size. And then we have, for example, tab size. Now, if you would want to search for something, of course, the same thing. We can search here up on the top. But we also have another option, and that is working with a JSON object. Now, I'm going to change my font size just so you can see what we're going to have within JSON. So let me delete it. And then in this case, I'm going to say that font size is not going to be 12. It's going to be 22. We're going to save that. And by the way, this is saved automatically. But if we navigate to a JSON, notice right now I have editor font size. So this is what I'm seeing. And now, of course, this is going to be 22. Now, what I can do right now is I can change it back here to a 30. Why this is important? Because for some of extensions, you're going to have to add some information within the JSON. So some extensions require for you to actually set it up your text editor in order for that extension to work. So this would be general overview of the Visual Studio Code. But again, please keep in mind as we're working, of course, we're going to explore more things in detail. Not bad, not bad. Now we're a little bit more familiar with Visual Studio Code, but instead of spending the rest of our time talking about Visual Studio Code, I would want to keep on moving and work on our first web page. And in order to set up anything as far as the web page goes, we're going to need a folder first. Now you can create a folder, of course, within your Finder. That is always your option. But in my case, I'm going to do it in desktop. Just keep in mind, it's the same thing. The reason why I'm doing it on desktop, because it's much easier for me to show you what is happening. But of course, later on, as you're creating more and more projects, I doubt you're going to save all of them on a desktop. So again, this is not a Visual Studio Code thing. I'm just going to right click it. Notice I have a option for new folder. You can call this whatever you would want. You can call this Uncle Peter. You can call this Bobby Went to Town. But in my case, I'm going to go with new folder. And the name is going to be simple HTML. Again, name is not important. As far as your folder, you're good to go. And then, of course, we would want to open that folder in our text editor. And essentially, we have three options. We have this neat one where we have right away open folder. Then, of course, we would need to look for it. So in our case, since I know that it is in the desktop, I can look for HTML. But this is what I was saying, that if we would have our project in the documents, of course, we would just search it in the documents. It doesn't really matter. Now, that would be one option. Now, the second one is up on the top. Notice I have these tabs that come with Visual Studio Code. I have file, edit, and all the way down to help. So what we can do is we can look for file, and then we have an open one. And since I already opened the folder, of course, I can just look for it. I can look for desktop, and then again, I can look for HTML and just open it in the text editor. Now, the last one is going to be very, very nifty one where we can just drag the folder. And again, we can do the same thing if the folder is, let's say, sitting in the documents or directory, call it whatever you'd want. And then you can just grab the directory and drag and drop it in the Visual Studio Code like so. Once I do, Notice here up on the top, we have HTML. What that means is that we successfully open up our directory in the Visual Studio Code, and now we can start working on our first web page. All right, we have the directory, but how we can create our first web page? Well, I'm glad you asked. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to maximize the screen on a Visual Studio Code. And as you can see, everything is small because we would need to customize, of course, our settings to make our fonts way bigger. What I'm going to do right now, though, is I'm going to show you how we can zoom in the Visual Studio Code. And then later, once we fix the settings, of course, everything is going to be much more clear. And the way we can zoom in and zoom out in the Visual Studio Code is the same as the browser. So we can press Command and plus. Notice how I'm zooming in. Or if I would want to zoom out, I would press Command and minus, like so. So again, I'm going to zoom in. And now we would need to create a file within the HTML directory. Now, the file we can create multiple ways. We can right-click it, and we have option of creating a new file, or we can hover over this guy. Notice it would also say a new file. And then for the homepage, we would always need to call this index and then HTML. And both of these things are important. The HTML extension essentially just tells what kind of file it is, because later we're going to have CSS files, we're going to have JavaScript files, and so on and so forth. So that's why it is important if you're creating HTML file to add this HTML extension. And notice right away how Visual Studio Code is very smart, and it right away also tells you, yeah, buddy, you just created a HTML file. As far as index, every time you're going to upload your project on the server, it's going to know that index is your homepage. So let's say if you're going to be creating an about page, you can call this whatever you would want, and you're just going to point it and you're going to say that that is the about page. But as far as the homepage, it always needs to be index HTML. Rest of the pages, contact page, about page, I don't know, project page, you can technically call it whatever you would want. But index is always going to be your homepage. I'm going to save it like so. And then, of course, we can start working here. Of course, we haven't covered any syntax technically yet. We just had a very brief overview. But since I would want to up and running with my first web page, why don't we create together first two elements, one heading and one paragraph, and then we're just going to take a look at how our web page looks in the browser. So remember, we needed to have the opening tag, and in my case, I'm going to go right away for heading one. And again, I'm going to cover this in a greater detail later on, what is essentially happening here. And we're going to say hello world, like so. And as you can see right away, when we created the opening tag, Visual Studio Code created the closing tag for us. So that's going to be hello world. And then we're going to have the paragraph. So again, let me open up the paragraph tags. And then here I'm going to say, this is my first web page, like so. And if you noticed, as I was typing here, you can see that I have this circle as well as I have this one here on the left-hand side. Now, what this tells is that we need to save our file. And we have multiple options where we can save the file. We can either use the shortcut, or in fact, we can do it the long way. What would be the long way? Well, we can go to File, then we can look for Save. And by the way, I'm going to zoom in just so I can see. And of course, we have an option of clicking and saving, or they right away suggest using the shortcut. And what would be the shortcut in my case? That would be Command S. Why would you want to use shortcuts? Because essentially, they're just going to speed up your workflow. And as we're progressing with the course, I'm going to show you multiple shortcuts that I use. So in this case, I'm going to press Command S, and I'm going to save my file. Now, in order to see our web page, we're going to go back to desktop. Then we're going to look for HTML. So I'm going to crack it open. And then I have my index HTML. And also notice how neatly we right away see this Chrome icon. Now, what this tells me is that, of course, I'm going to be opening this up in Chrome. And we have a few options. We can just right away double click it. That, of course, is going to open up in the Chrome. Or we can have the right click. And then, of course, we have multiple other options like Safari, like Firefox, or Google Chrome. And of course, we have different options as well. But in our case, what we're looking for, well, we're looking for the Chrome. So I'm going to zoom back out. Then I'm going to right click it, or I'm sorry, double left click it. And then we have our first web page, just like that. And then, of course, again, we can zoom in even more if we wanted to. This is going to be 250%. And even though it doesn't look like the most sophisticated web page ever, trust me, this is a huge step. we created our first web page. Well, setting up our first web page was definitely a huge success. There's something missing in our page, and that is proper HTML document structure. Before we implement it, though, in our web page, let's take a short trip back to Slideville and talk about the general concepts first. You see, all HTML documents follow the same basic structure. So the browser that renders the file knows what to do. At the very top, we have a doc type declaration that tells the browser what HTML version the page is written in. The doc type you see in a slide corresponds to the latest version of HTML, which is HTML5. Next, we have HTML root element that will wrap all our code in a page and will always contain one head element and one body element. Now notice how everything is neatly sandwiched, or you can also say nested inside HTML element. That is really important when it comes to HTML. When we have a parent element in HTML, if we decide to place a child element inside, we need to make sure that the whole child element is inside the parent, meaning the opening and closing tags of the child element are in between the opening and closing tags of the parent. The same way, if we have multiple children elements, in this case head and body, we have to make sure that we don't place opening or closing tag inside some other child element. Otherwise, we will get an error. Notice how body element only starts after the closing tag of the head element. That's the proper way of adding child elements in HTML. When it comes to head element, it contains information about the page. Like, for example, page title, metadata, and links to external resources like style sheets and JavaScript files. Also, I would like to mention that even though the content within the head element will not be visible on a page that is being rendered, head element and its content play a vital role in overall web page setup. With your permission, I would like to hold off on covering head element content in any more detail, because at this point in time, we have more important business to attend. Just remember, in short, head element contains info about the page and will not be visible on the page. Now, body element is whole another ball game, because this is where we'll do most of our work, like, for example, add headings, paragraphs, links, images, and essentially create our fantastic web pages. Okay, now that we know basics of HTML document structure, let's implement it in our first web page.